Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our third webinar in the quarterly series. My name is Amy Hollenkamp. I'm with USI, and we are excited to be partnering with Boulay on timely topics that are aimed to help you as business leaders adapt to the changing times. So for sake of time, we'll get started. Brittany Hancock, the Audit Manager at Boulay, will be taking us through 401k audit readiness. Oh, and I forgot to mention, we will be recording this. So we will be sending you a link after the event. And if you have questions at all, please use the Q&A box and we'll be sure to address those at the end of the presentation. Thanks. And with that, Brittany.
All right, thank you, Amy. So the first question that always comes up with 401k plans is, when is an audit needed? So if your plan has 100 or more eligible participants at the beginning of the plan year, then generally an audit is required. However, there is one exception to that rule. It's called the 80-120 exception. So for example, if you have a plan and between years, you don't have more than 120 eligible participants, then you would not be required to have an audit. So to use an example, if you had 90 eligible participants in that first year and 119 in that second year, you would not need an audit in either year. However, if at the beginning of the plan year, your eligible employees jumps up past 120, then an audit would be required. So when you're looking at how many eligible employees you have, one thing to consider is it's not just your active employees who are currently eligible based on the criteria for your plan, but you also have to evaluate how many retired or separated employees you have in that 401k plan, as well as any deceased employees that have funds in your 401k plan as part of that calculation. So when you're looking at getting ready for that first 401k plan, and if you're getting close to that, 80 to 120, important things to start thinking of is that type of documentation that would be needed. So for example, some of the big pieces that come up is employee census reports. That includes your listing of all, employees that are eligible for that plan, as well as any determination factors such as hire dates, birth dates, gross wages, eligible compensation that gets factored into the different calculations in your 401k plan. This is something that you typically would have as part of that non-discrimination testing that your TPA or third-party administrator is calculating each year. Other things just to have on hand is copies of your plan document, including any amendments, as well as your adoption agreement and plan service agreement. Other things that are important to have on hand are the employee files. So certain things that can factor into eligibility. So for example, if you have a criteria that says an employee has to be age 21 to be eligible for that plan, you'd want to have documentation that supports when that employee's birth date is, so that you can back into what age they were and ensure that they are in fact eligible, as well as payroll records, deferral change supporting documentation. As part of that audit, the auditors will look at the deferral changes during the year to make sure that there's support for those changes that were made to the employee deferrals. Other things to keep in mind to just kind of include within that participant file is salary and compensation agreements. Those are important for determining that that employee is being compensated the correct amount that they have signed to, or if there's any bonuses or other raises that's been documented as well. Meeting minutes. This is something that many 401k plans may not have. Some plans do have an investment committee. Others might just have it mentioned in normal board meetings. So one thing just to kind of keep an eye out for if that is applicable to your plan, as well as a copy of the plan's fidelity bond. With all of that, usually that first year audit is not just an audit of that initial year that you're required to be audited. There's usually some work on the back end to look at prior years as well. So with that, you want to have typically 5 years of documentation on hand. So with 401k audits, it's not unusual to have issues, especially within that first year. So just to kind of touch on some of the big issues that we often find, incorrect definition of eligible compensation is probably one of the most common. So for example, if your plan defines eligible compensation as W-2 wages minus any fringe benefits, and you have a car allowance, say for example, with your employees, that would typically be excluded. And if that is being included as part of that eligible compensation that's being deferred on, then that would be considered an error. So always something just to take a look at, what is the definition of eligible compensation for your plan specifically. Other issues that we see are incorrect deferral withholdings. So for example, if an employee has elected 6% and only 5% is being deferred, that's considered an error that has to be addressed as well. One other item that we pretty much see with many audits is the contribution remittance timing. One piece that plays into this is that a while back, the DOL had a rule for safe harbor plans that noted if your contributions were remitted within 15 days of the next month, then you were timely. But the DOL has kind of gone away from this rule and really looks at when is administratively feasible. So for example, if your payroll person is on vacation, but employees still got paid, it would make sense that you'd be able to have a backup plan to get those contributions remitted to your TPA as well. Since if those are not deferred timely, employees can lose out on some of those earnings in their plan. Other items that we sometimes see is the employer match criteria that's being used to determine eligibility. So for example, if your plan uses the number of hours worked, you'd want to make sure that you've got accurate records that are being used to determine whether or not that employee's met that criteria, as well as using incorrect IRS limits, which we'll kind of go over on the next slide. So I've included some of the IRS limits that are important to note. I'd say probably the one that comes up most frequently is that compensation limit. Now your company may not have any employees that are meeting this limit, but it's an important one to just watch out for. So the amount of compensation that can be used in determining your employer and employee contribution is limited to $290,000 for 2021. These limits will change every year, so always important to kind of keep an eye on that and watch out for those IRS releases as far as the updated limits each year. So I won't go too much more into the detail regarding the IRS limits, but if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out. So with all of that, why is being ready for that 401k audit important? Well, a first year audit, if there's many errors, can become quite costly for the company, both in terms of time and money, depending on the amount of corrections that have to go through. Because with each, error identified, you have to identify further out the population and look at the correction method that's prescribed by the IRS and the DOL. So one thing that we, have come up with at Boulay is a 401k audit readiness service to help plans who are getting ready for that audit take a look at some of those key items, such as, reviewing the plan document, looking and testing to determine whether or not the eligible compensation that's being used to calculate deferrals is correct and accurate based on the plan document and adoption agreement, as well as recalculating the employer match. Other pieces that we would be looking at is testing of employee eligibility criteria to see if there's any issues that stand out, as well as testing a select number of participants to walk through, as we would in a normal 401k audit, the deferral contribution, making sure that that's correct, as well as looking at some of the payroll remittances to make sure that's timely, or if there's items that we're identifying that we're addressing those with you as far as ways to improve that timing. So if during those procedures, if we identify any issues that need further attention or need correction methods, our team is always willing to help you understand those and correct those to make sure that your plan is ready when it comes time to be required for an audit. So with that, if you do have any more questions, feel free to reach out either directly to me or to our firm at learnmore@boulaygroup.com. And with that, I will turn it over to Amy if there's any questions in the Q&A.
I don't see any questions at the moment, but again, feel free to reach out to Brittany. Brittany, thank you for that summary. And for sake of time, we'll keep moving forward. On the call here, we also have Wade Johnson, who's the Senior Vice President of Employee Benefits at USI. And he's going to be taking us through best practices for negotiating your health insurance renewal. So with that, Wade.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you all for being here today. It's this time of the year where renewals are upon us. So everybody is kind of waiting with bated breath on what the renewal is going to look like and what can we do. And in this job market, obviously, we know how expensive this benefit is and what can we do to drive down even 1% means a great deal of money to most of the organizations we work with. And so our goal today is just to teach you some of the negotiation techniques that we use. Your broker or consultant that you work with might be doing this already, but I think empowering you to have this information allows you to try to see kind of the best way to drive down the renewal increases that everyone has seen. And so there are many techniques we use, but the three that I'm going to focus on today, and I'm going to spend the majority of my time really on the first bullet, and that's pre-renewal underwriting. I'll explain a little bit more about what that is. Marketing to other carriers, which is very common, and that's changing a little bit even as we speak. The market is changing and who the carriers are and how many, and so good and bad things going on in the marketplace from that perspective. And then the threat of marketing, what that can do for you, and then I'll end by just talking about some things of like things to consider when you're considering other healthcare companies if you are going to move for the sake of the dollars that can be saved. So with that, we'll talk about pre-renewal underwriting, and to level set things a little bit. It's important just to understand, those of you that have ever heard me speak know that I try to get like 30 minutes of information in 12 minutes of content. So I'm going to talk quickly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on digging down on some of these things, but we have many different people on the phone today. And so just to put things into perspective, in the commercial insurance world, that's what we're talking about. There are three groups, there are three sizes. There's kind of your small, medium, and large. The small employers are those with fewer than 50 eligible employees. The way you can usually dictate if you're considered a small employer is whether you have age-banded rates, which means does a 20-year-old pay less than a 50-year-old on the bill you receive from your carrier. The reason that's important is those plans, one of the things that changed with the Affordable Care Act is regardless of your health, that group of people will have the same rates. So whether you're a healthy group and the employer across the street is unhealthy, you will have the same rates if your benefits all match up and you're with the same carrier. So in some ways, oftentimes small employers feel like there's nothing they can do, they can't negotiate. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but I don't want you to lose hope if you're in that group. Then there's the mid-size employers, which are those between 50 and 100. They get some data, not a ton of data, but they have what we call composite rates, which means every employee, regardless of age, will have the same price. And then you have your large employers that are those over 100. The only reason we point this out is they get a little bit more data. When we have over 100 employees, we get a little bit more claims information, which helps negotiate. So that kind of defines the size pieces, but the funding mechanisms also matter when we talk about negotiations. So you have your fully insured premium. That's what the majority of the folks on this call probably are. And that means you're paying a premium, and every month it's the same, or it just varies a little bit based on enrollment. But you pay at the end of the year, depending on if you run well or run poorly. Your increase on your renewal is dictated by that. If you're self-funded, it means that your claims are you're paying your actual claims, and you're going to see a different amount taken out of your bill every month. It's a little bit riskier, but there's a bigger reward. If you run well, you get the benefits of that. Again, I'm not going to talk a lot about different funding, but just to put this into perspective as we talk about underwriting and negotiations. And then level funding, I'm just going to take 1 minute and talk about that, because especially for you small employers, and we'll talk about this when we talk about different carriers in the marketplace, this is a really good alternative for those smaller employers that feel like they're stuck, that their rates are the rates, there's nothing to negotiate, there's nothing you can do. All of the carriers, for the most part now, have some sort of program that is designed to allow you, if you're a healthier group, to have that discussion. Now, you don't always know if you're a healthier group, and that's something that we as consultants help people with. Your broker or consultant can talk about that with you. But if you're not hearing about that, that'd be something to ask about come renewal time. Is level funding something that might help our group, and kind of explore that and see whether that's beneficial or not. So that's just to level set kind of where we're talking about, or what we're talking about. The biggest part of renewal negotiation really starts with pre-renewal underwriting. What is it? Why is it important? Well, pre-renewal underwriting is, in my context, in my vernacular, is where throughout the year, we are taking claims data on your group of employees and we're analyzing it before your renewal comes out. So it's like a preemptive strike. It's being proactive instead of being reactive. And so we actually take this data and we dump it in a funnel. We meet with all the carriers throughout the year so we understand what their formula is going to say. And we hold them accountable to the numbers that they tell us earlier out throughout the year. Then therefore we can sit down with our clients and say, hey, you know what, we're running a little hot this year. Our increase might be more than we expect. What do we want to do about that? What can we do? What can we talk about? A claim is a claim. You certainly can't prevent your employees, and you don't want to prevent your employees from using your health insurance. It's a big part of the reason you have employee benefits, to attract and retain your employees. But what can we do behind the scenes to get in front of the renewal so we're not staring at a 25% increase with 2 months to figure out the solution before we have open enrollment or before we actually renew? So the more time you have, the better you can do it. The quicker you can negotiate, I guess I'll say. And the importance of that is so vast. And we're going to talk a little bit in the next slide about what sort of things we can uncover and the reason it's so important. There's a lot of vernacular in our world, and it's scary to a lot of people. We spend a lot of time trying to educate our clients. Whether you want to know or need to know, I'm someone who tries to over-educate people. So medical trend is what the cost is a year from now to go to the doctor versus what the cost is today. That varies a lot year over year. It's been as high as 12% in some years. It's been as low as 5%. It's right about 7 and 8, between 7 and 8 right now, depending on which carrier you talk to. But that matters because that's what they use to increase your premiums every year. So we don't want them to overstate that. Hidden profit areas. This is an area a lot of people don't really understand. It's very deep in the health insurance world. But when you see a report that says, here are your claims, there's some things in there that I would not argue are, I don't believe are claims. It's shared savings, capitation. Those are things where physicians get bonuses and reimbursements based on criteria of how good the care is they gave, how many patients did they see, things like that. That's not a claim. That's a cost of doing business. And so that should not be trended up next year, which is part of the game that the carriers play. Manual credibility. This is how much your claims matter versus their overall book of business. Really important piece, and I'm going to show you 2 examples after I'm done with this list to show you what this means and what you can do with that information. But it's very vital that you don't let the carriers kind of get away with playing a game around those numbers. Pooling or stop loss charges. Pooling is what we call for fully insured. Stop loss is what we call for self-funded. This is the cost of the insurance behind the scenes. So many of you, if you had a renewal, you understand this, but in each carrier, they have a pooling level. Many are around 50,000, depends on the size of the bigger you are, the higher the number gets. But what it means is if it's a $50,000 pooling level, it means that one employee cannot hurt you more than that amount, or $50,000. So if I have $1 million claim, only 50,000 of it can count towards my renewal calculation. Really important because number one, you want to back out any of those large claims, which are a lot of what drive increases. But there's a charge for that, and that charge is up to 17–18% of your total premium. So it's a big number, and so you need to know what that amount is, and we can't let the carriers just subjectively increase that number for your group differently than they're going to do it for every other client that we work with. And then there's the dreaded COVID adjustment. I could spend hours on this, but what I would say bluntly is this: that the carriers are trying to use this as a way to say, back a year and a half ago, people couldn't go to the doctor. And so the best example is a knee replacement or hip replacement. Those things were supposed to be done, but because of COVID, they weren't able to get done. So they're just being postponed. Well, that was true a year ago, but that shouldn't be true anymore. Anyone that needed to get a procedure done got it done. And so there should not be an increase in claims that occur during that piece. There is some subjectivity around mental health. There might be mental health adjustments because there might be additional mental health claims coming because of COVID, but that hasn't yet to be seen. And the way we play the game is that the carriers don't get to make assumptions. They have to use data, and data is your friend if you know how to use it. So I'm going to show you two examples of one example. In this particular first example, there's a lot of data on here. I'm not going to go through it line by line because I don't have time, but I tried to highlight a couple things. This was a carrier that did not work with, or a client, excuse me, that did not work with us prior to getting their renewal. They came to us and said, hey, you've been talking to us for a long time about how great you are. Here's our renewal. Tell us what you can do. They looked at this and they said, wow, the bottom right-hand corner says we get a 9.9 or we'll say 10% increase. That doesn't seem that terrible compared to what we hear are going on in the streets. But the things that I've highlighted are the areas in which the carrier is playing a game. And so you see COVID adjustment. I already talked a little bit about that. That ends up being about 2% for this particular client, where we argue that out. We negotiate that number out. We don't believe it's true. The other things that are towards the middle are the what we call the credibility. So if you see under experience generated, it says $475. Again, I'm not going to go into the meat of why this is the number. But what they're saying is that the claims data of this particular client, they averaged out to this 475 number. The credibility percentage of 50% says we're going to give 50% weight to that number. But then they say our book of business is actually running at $695. And so we're going to give 50% weight to that number. Well, you can see that that number is quite a bit higher than the experience that this group had. So that's a game the carrier is trying to bump up or inflate their numbers to get to that spot. Now, in this particular case, there's a risk score factor, and I highlighted that for a different reason. This is not a really large employer, but they're fully insured. What that green risk score factor, and not every carrier uses it, just 1 out of the 4 main ones here in Minnesota, they're saying that you're a better risk. You're a better risk than the norm. So that helps offset that community credibility piece, but it also is a great idea then to look at level funding, because what it's saying is that you're a healthier group than the norm, and how do we take advantage of that? Now, if this was just 1 year, probably wouldn't overreact to that, but if this was years 2 or 3, we would look at different alternative funding mechanisms. So what I would say is that the beauty of this is we got this renewal down to 2% just by negotiating on the couple things that I highlighted right there. So that is the power of underwriting. And if you can do it before you get the renewal, it's even more powerful. In the next slide, I'll show you an example of where we did a renewal. It's a little bit hard to read, tried to circle some numbers, but this is a larger group. We used 2 years of information, but this was data that we pulled before their renewal. Now, the bottom line in the lower right-hand corner sounds terrible. It's a 17% increase. It's a big number, but claims are claims. And these formula numbers, this is the way the game is played, is the data just funnels in and you vet it out at the end. So in this particular case, we had done this before. We had met with the client months ahead of time and said, look, things are running poorly. What do we want to do about it? Let's get a strategy in place, which we did. When the renewal came out, it actually came out using the exact same formula, but just using this particular carrier's own game of the system came out at 24%. The same exact dollars came up 7% higher just because they played with some of those things that we talked about. We talked about the community adjustment, the fact that their community, where are they running compared to the manual rate, some things like that. So we were able to get them down to 15% just from negotiation. But because we had talked about this so early, we actually decided to go to the market, which is the next strategy that I want to talk about. So when you know way ahead of time that you're looking at a 17% increase, it gives you time to go to the market, which for you as an employer shouldn't be a lot of work. You give some data to your broker, your consultant, they go to the market for you. But what's changed in the marketplace right now is understanding how that works and why it's different for each carrier. So historically in Minnesota, we've had 4 main carriers: Blue Cross of Minnesota, Medica, Health Partners, and Preferred One. Side note, Preferred One, if anyone is with them, they just got bought by United Healthcare. There's going to be a year or two where it's going to take a while for that to integrate, but it does take one of our kind of weapons away, our arrows out of our quiver, so to speak, in the marketplace. Again, there's a lot to talk about there, but I won't talk about that today. But the other thing is that our market has expanded. So right now we've added, about 4 years ago now, the state of Minnesota expanded to allow for-profit companies to sell insurance plans in Minnesota, which allowed United Healthcare and Allina Aetna to form a different healthcare company to quote. So now we have 2 more people we can go to the market, and the market can drive down price, just like in anything that you do in your life. The other thing that's really evolved over the last couple of years is different companies have come into the marketplace. Gravy is one that does a level funded plan, and I alluded to that earlier. UMR, Health Easy, there's some other third-party administrators that work in the self-funded space, but they've created small employer types of plans that can be used at very minimum to negotiate with your current carrier and drive down that price. So whether they do or don't come in competitive, it still can be valuable because you can use that. And an example is the 17% increase I had alluded to earlier. We went to the market and we got a carrier to come in at 3%. That client is going to make a move. They're going to move from their current carrier to their incumbent, or from their incumbent to a new carrier, because even when we negotiated and we shared that number, that 3% increase with the current carrier, they said, you know, we'll come down a little, but we're not going to get all the way to 3%. We're only going to get to about 7%. And the employer said, you know what, we think it's time for us to switch carriers because of that. But knowing how these carriers all work is very important because they all use different terminology. They all use different look back periods. So Blue Cross uses a 2-year look back. All the others use a 1 year. Why that matters is if you had a really bad year this year, but a really good year a year prior, Blue Cross might be more attractive. Conversely, if you had a terrible year 2 years ago and a great year a year ago, the other carriers might be attractive. But it's important to understand the marketplace so you understand how that's going to play out when you go to the marketplace and what to expect. With that, then the last slide I want to talk about is just other things to think about. So if you can go one more slide, Amy, the considerations when you're going to make a change are, what's it worth? Every employer is different on what the cost of moving is. And I just put down some of the things that I think have become, we have some clients that'll move for 2%. We have some that will move for 0, they'll move for 1. But most say, at 3-4% because our HR team is already jammed. Last thing we want to do is force a move because there are pains in changing. And I listed a couple of them here because I think it's important. There are the things in this day and age in Minnesota, all the providers are pretty much in network. So it used to be when you had more HMOs and you had some POS, point of service plans, things like that, where people were like, well, I don't want to change my doctor. That's not as important anymore. I won't say it's not important. It usually isn't an issue because for the most part, all the carriers have, for the most part, the same doctors, with the exception of chiropractors and mental health providers. Those move around quite a bit, but that's usually not something that is a huge deterrent in moving unless you have people in different states. Then that's a discussion point. The prescription drug one is the one that I would probably talk the most about because every one of the carriers has a different formulary list. And if any of you have ever changed carriers, you understand this, that sometimes it means an employee has to start over with step therapy or prior authorization or things like that, where they want to make sure they get the drug that they really want and they need. And so that's a disruption piece you want to think about. Technology and payroll, if you're using an online enrollment system, what does that mean? How do you set that up? And then there's always the public relations part. And this is kind of the subjective piece that no one can really put a number on, but change is hard for many people. And in this day and age where people are fighting for bodies, do you want to go through that change at risk of losing someone? Only you know your culture, but if you talk through that with your broker or consultant, I think that's an important piece to bring up as well. So that's a really, really high level download on kind of what, how to negotiate, where to push some buttons and try to drive down those increases. Don't be afraid to reach out to me or Amy if you have any questions about it. You can get our information on the slide, or, again, we're going to send this to you electronically. But good luck. Renewal season is upon us, and I know that it's a scary time for everyone because there's only so much money in the coffers, and the increases that people are seeing certainly are usually exceeding that of revenues. So anything we can do to knock 1%, 2% off your plan can save somebody's job, give someone a bonus, free up some cash. We just understand the importance of that, and that's a big part of our role. So that's all I really had. Amy, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add or not.
Oh, thank you so much for that overview, and we appreciate all of your time today. We hope to see you all at our next quarterly webinar series. Thank you.